This next video covers Baroque art in Spain, and the Baroque in Spain has some similarities to that in Italy, but with some differences, so we'll try to point those out as we go along. First off, we tend to see more macabre, kind of grittier scenes in Spain. We see a lot of representations of wooden sculptures. Some sculptures were used in processions, religious processions, Holy Week processions. One of the most famous sculptors of the time is Gregorio Fernandez. What we see here is a wooden sculpture that's polychromed. This was not used in processions, it was used in an altarpiece, but it reveals some of that idea of Baroque realism. It's very vivid, it looks very alive, and by choosing to represent Christ, the reclining Christ, is polychromed, like painted wood, instead of using marble, you create a very different effect. You make the figure look much more alive, much more vivid, and so you can really highlight the pain and the suffering. And remember that at this time, things like the spiritual exercises, contemplating the suffering of Christ, was very, very important. And so sculptures like this were used as tools in achieving those exercises, those prayers, things like that. So I'm showing you a couple of views of the same sculpture, and the idea here is that he's slightly tilted to the side so that you can clearly see the fifth wound here. You can see a zoomed in version here. The nail wounds are clearly visible. So the idea here is that those are part of your contemplation and part of the visual that's being created. And it's about 5 feet tall, or 5 feet long, so it's a little less than life size. What we'll mainly be focusing on is painting, and so we'll start off looking at José de Ribera, or Giuseppe de Ribera. He goes by both names. He worked primarily in southern Italy, which at the time was a Spanish territory, and so he kind of is connected to both traditions, Italian and Spanish. So as we look at this work, St. Jerome with the angel, we can see that he's clearly drawing on some of the traditions of Caravaggio. So if you remember back to the Contarelli chapel in Rome, done by Caravaggio, where you have those 3 scenes of St. Matthew, this is very similar to the inspiration of St. Matthew, where St. Matthew's dressed in red, and then you have the angel above him inspiring him. Well, here, this is where St. Jerome has gone off into the desert. He's removed himself from the temptations of the city, and he's gone off, and he's like leaving the traditions of paganism behind. He's contemplating his mortality. He's contemplating, the ideas of salvation, perhaps, of Christianity, and the idea that, he's going off to do his translation, that he's going to create the Vulgate. And so what we see here is St. Jerome looking older, but also weathered. Like if we zoom in, if you can just see this passage here, this portion of his stomach looks kind of slack and loose, and it looks so very real. So the idea here is you have a combination of kind of the toned flesh, pale flesh of the angel who's appearing to him and inspiring him in a vision, and then you have the weathered look of Jerome, who's been out in the desert suffering. So very, very important in this period of Counter-Reformation Spain. Spain's very Catholic area at this point. José de Ribera also created the Martyrdom of St. Philip. This is also strikingly similar to the martyrdom or the crucifixion of St. Peter, which was from that Shirazi chapel by Caravaggio. And so you have the same idea where the martyr, the figure who's about to be killed, is spotlit right at the center. José de Ribera definitely is working in a Baroque realism tradition, and so you see the body being stretched, and then you see one of his executioners. They're usually very faceless. This one's coming out towards us. We can see a little bit of his face, but really he just looks kind of monstrously large, and he's this foreshortened figure that's kind of coming out towards us. So it highlights the brutality of it. It's definitely placing it in a classical period, or in the period of the time around Christ. So he's trying to add these classical columns to orient you there. But it's a very gritty scene overall. You can see kind of the dirtiness of the flesh, the wear on the body, and all of this is very common in Ribera's work. Another example of Ribera's work is a boy with a clubfoot. And what we sometimes see in Spanish painting is an interest in the unusual, an interest in the unexpected. Ribera actually created a very famous work of a bearded woman. There's a number of representations of dwarves. In this example, José de Ribera is representing a boy with a clubfoot. And so what we see here is a boy who, even with all the trials and tribulations that life has thrown him, even though he's clearly a young man, or a man of very young man of very little means, as he's wearing these rags, he looks very happy. He's smiling. And this is the first example where we've seen someone really smiling with their teeth here. We really don't see that very frequently in paintings. Big smiles are usually associated with the lower classes, so that could be a reason why Ribera is incorporating it here. But also the idea that this young man isn't bothered by his conditions, that he seems very happy, that he has faith, and we know that he has faith because he's holding a little note that says, "Give me alms for the love of God," basically, like, please give me alms. And he's holding onto his crutch, but in a very grand way, almost like a king, or almost like he's going out on a hunt. So even for one who is facing such challenges, he's being presented in a very, very grand way. He's standing up high on the horizon as if he controls all of this land, and he's not creating a large panel painting that would kind of overwhelm the figure. He's really making this figure dominate the scene. So it's somewhat unusual. Our next focus piece is Francisco de Zurbarán's still life with lemons, oranges, and a rose from 1633. It's actually signed and dated. And so what we see here is a 3-part still life. So remember, still lifes are new subjects. We really didn't have those before. So still lifes, landscapes, genre scenes. Genre scenes are just scenes of everyday life. These are new things during this period, new subjects that are in addition to portraits and then history paintings. So let's focus in on this still life. What we see here is the lemons, the oranges with some blossoms on top of it, and then a rose and a cup of water. So usually the first thing people think of is the Trinity, this idea that there must be some kind of symbolism in this very carefully arranged group. You have 3 parts. This has got to be the Trinity, ideas of God the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Other possibilities could be associations with the Virgin Mary. So a lot of people say there's this cup of water, this beautiful ceramic cup sitting on a silver or pewter plate, and then it has a pure cup of water in it, so the idea of speaking to purity, and then a rose, and a rose is often associated with the Virgin. And this rose actually has no thorns. It's very, very hard to see here, but there's actually a stem, and it has no thorns. So in the fact that it's this beautiful thing with nothing bad or dangerous about it. Everything kind of bad has been taken away, and that's what the Virgin was equated to or associated with. And then also we have these white blossoms, these orange blossoms, which always smell so sweet. These can also be associated with purity, so some people believe that as well. Some people have associated the fruit with the Passion. So there have been a number of readings to it, but it's important to know that there most likely is some kind of larger Christian significance to this arrangement, and that still lives aren't just to be read as literal representations of whatever they are. You're usually supposed to read it a bit more deeply, symbolically, allegorically. There's usually a number of levels to get through, so that's something to think about. Our most famous painter from the Spanish, what we would call the Spanish Golden Age, is Diego Velázquez. He created this painting when he was relatively young. So this was one of his early paintings. It's called Old Woman Cooking Eggs, and what we see here is a painting that really shows off his skill. So this is a period where Velázquez is making his way as a painter, and eventually he will be named Painter of the King into the Habsburg court. And clearly he's trying to show off what he can do. And so what we see here in the Old Woman Cooking Eggs is that he's showing us his ability to represent a variety of different materials. It's overwhelming, the variety that he has here. So first off, focusing in on the action that's happening here with this woman cooking eggs, is you can see this vessel holding the eggs, and you really can see the eggs kind of cooking before your very eyes. You can see them becoming solidified. And then you can see, a vessel that's brass or different metal vessels. You can see a ceramic vessel that's glazed on top and more basic earthenware on the bottom. A knife that lays across with a perfect shadow. A metal spoon back here, a basket. So just a huge variety of different objects that he's representing, almost like a still life, but then he's making it more of a narrative scene. We're not sure what the story is here. If there is a story, we've lost the source for it. But there seems to be a play of opposites happening. That's what some people have said, where you have an older woman and a young boy. So old and young. male and female. So all of this kind of acting as a contrast, again, showing what he can do. He can paint old people, he can paint young people, he can paint men, he can paint women. So clearly, as a young man, Diego Velázquez is showing off what he can do in this painting. And if you have a chance to zoom in on it, definitely do so. Another famous work of Velázquez is Los Borrachos, and Los Borrachos is a painting of, it means the drinkers, or the drunkards. And so what we see here is Velázquez's work in a mythological or pagan subject. So of course we're in very, very Catholic Counter-Reformation Spain. So if Velázquez is going to work in this type of subject matter, he has to do it pretty cautiously. He spends time in Italy, he's exposed to this type of subject matter, but he just has to do it a little differently in Spain. And so what we see here is a representation of Bacchus, very similar to how we might see it with Caravaggio, a Bacchus that looks very earthy and like a boy that, you know, would just be in your studio that you could paint. And then we see him here with men who clearly have that kind of gritty, aged skin, kind of like that contrast we saw in the Ribera between the angel and Saint Jerome. So men who've been working, and one of them is being crowned by Bacchus. And the idea here is probably that these men have been working all day, and the idea is that at the end of the day they're enjoying their drink, and that's what Bacchus provides. He provides leisure and respite and relaxation. So that's what we see probably represented in this painting. Another Velázquez is the Surrender at Breda. At this point, he has become painter of the king. So this is, the king is Philip IV, and Philip IV at this point is a wonderful collector of arts, but at this point the Habsburg dynasty is losing power, they're starting to lose lands, and they're running out of money. They're bankrupting themselves. They're not getting as much gold from the New World as they once did. However, that doesn't stop them from using a lot of propaganda. So what we see here are things like the Surrender at Breda, which was displayed in one of the palaces in Madrid in the Hall of the Realms to display how big and how powerful the Spanish Empire was. So what we see here is a general receiving the surrender of the group at Breda. So this is in northern Europe, and so what we see here is kind of a ragtag army that's presenting the key to the general here, and the Spanish side clearly looks much more organized, much more powerful, and you can see there's things burning in the background. But the idea here is that the Spanish weren't brutal in the way they took over this town, and they were very kind about it. At least that's how they would like you to think they were, they would want you to think they conducted this conquering or kind of reconquering to put down any revolts. So this functions as part of the propaganda, even though Spain is kind of on the downward spin at this point. And in fact, the Habsburgs will eventually fall out of power. Okay. Velázquez's most famous work is Las Meninas, a very, very famous painting. And the key message here is that Velázquez is asserting his social status. It's, of course, celebrating the royal family. The way it's created is extremely unusual. Nothing like this had ever been painted before. So what we see here is Velázquez, who's putting himself in a room with the royal family. We have the Infanta here, the daughter of the king, and then we have the king and queen just entering into the room. And we don't see them represented, actually their bodies, we just see their reflection. And so in fact, we are in the place of the king and queen. And in fact, this would have been in the king's office. So we become the king as we're viewing this painting. And so we see here the Infanta, the king and queen behind them, the ladies in waiting, or the Las Meninas, the maids of honor for the Infanta. We see two dwarfs here, which were common in the court, a dog that's being slightly tormented, chaperones and a bodyguard, or chaperone and a bodyguard, a man who's kind of opening the doors as the king and queen move through. And the moment here is as the king and queen enter, everyone's stopping to look up, of course, because they're the main attraction. Velázquez is here, as I mentioned, and then there's copies after Rubens up here. Velázquez really is trying to say, you know, I am a painter of high status, I hang out with the king and queen, I am an individual of great significance. And in fact, he had this cross of St. James painted onto his chest. What is he painting here? Probably it's supposed to be Las Meninas. It could be a large portrait of the Infanta. It could be a portrait of the king and queen. There's a lot of debate about this work that will continue to happen over a long period of time. The last Velázquez is the Rokeby Venus. Clearly, again, he's kind of grappling with ideas of mythology and images from Italy. We see here, rather than a front-facing Venus, one that's turning away from us, but again, he's playing with ideas of reflection, and clearly he's incorporating the Cupid with the wings. And we're also playing with ideas of vanity. Our final examples come from the Ultra Baroque period, just showing you some churches very quickly where you can see some of the ornate decoration that's included in Santa Prisca, which is this one, and then Santa Maria Tonazzintla